it's very difficult to follow such a brilliant presentation as Anil Seth just gave us. Anything I say is bound to seem a bit one-dimensional. And in a sense it is one-dimensional or fewer dimensions, because I'm going to talk about a dimension of consciousness which hasn't had much of a look in yet, although people have paid lip service to it. And Neil was talking about what I would call cognizance, cognitive consciousness. I want to talk about sentience. Everyone mentions sentience because sentience is in fact a word on everybody's lips these days. The United Kingdom government has recently passed a law declaring that lobsters are legally sentient. Wise men and women worry that artificial intelligence may be becoming sentient. And we're going to hear from David Chalmers that, at least the last time I heard it, he thinks that large language models might be 10% sentient, or rather there's a 10% chance that they're sentient. And meanwhile, respected philosophers, including Stuart Hameroff, suggest that the whole universe might, in a sense, be sentient. Google Ngram reports that the frequency of the word sentience in Google Books has increased in print, so it's increased in frequency 7 times in the last 100 years. I hope you can read that. It goes back to 1920, and you'll see that most of that increase in the word sentience has happened in the last 50 years. But what are people talking about when they ask whether crabs or chatbots or the Milky Way are sentient? Well, there's a lot of fudging when it comes to definition, but it's pretty clear that what lies behind the question is nothing less than phenomenal consciousness, sensory qualia, the kind of consciousness that we all believe matters. And indeed, the use of the term phenomenal consciousness has in fact increased in recent years in a way that exactly parallels the use of the word sentience. I think this convergence is really quite interesting. Now, my own working assumption is that phenomenal consciousness is a biological capacity with clear physical boundaries. Living organisms either have it or they don't have it. But still, I'll say up front that as a biological capacity, I think it's more extraordinary and more unlikely than scientists and philosophers yet imagine, even those in this room. And we have some pretty imaginative people right here. I'm going to begin with a bit of personal history. The cover of the New Scientist magazine 50 years ago showed a picture of a rhesus monkey with the headline, "A blind monkey that sees everything." This monkey, named Helen, was part of a study into the neuropsychology of vision led by Larry Weisskranz in the psychology lab at the University of Cambridge in 1965. Larry had surgically removed the primary visual cortex at the back of Helen's brain. Following the operation, Helen appeared to be quite blind. When I met her a year later as a PhD student just starting, it seemed that nothing had changed about Helen's vision. But something puzzled me. In mammals, there are 2 main pathways from the eye to the brain, an evolutionary ancient one, the descendant of the visual system used by fish and frog and reptiles, that goes to the optic tectum in the midbrain. And then there's the newer one that goes up to the cortex. In Helen, the older system was, the cortical system had been eliminated. But the other system, the older one, was still intact. Now, if a frog can see using the optic tectum, why not Helen? While my supervisor, Larry Weisskranz, was away at a conference, I took the chance to investigate further. I sat with Helen and played with her, offering her treats for any attempt to engage with me by vision. And to my delight, she began to respond. Within a few hours, I had her reaching out to take pieces of apple from my hand when I waved them in front of her. Within a week, she was reaching out to touch a flashing light. 7 years later, she was running around a complex arena, deftly avoiding obstacles, picking up peanuts from the floor. This is an old little movie taken with a clockwork camera. This monkey has no primary visual cortex. much longer version of this. Now, I think you'll agree that to anyone who had observed Helen, this was in 1972, and who didn't know the history, it would have seemed that her eyesight was now quite normal. Yet could she really see everything, as the New Scientist cover seemed to imply? I myself didn't believe so. I found it hard to put my finger on what was wrong, what was missing, but my hunch was that Helen herself still doubted that she could see. She seemed strangely unsure of herself. If she was frightened or upset, her confidence would desert her and she'd stumble about as if in the dark again. The title I gave to my article inside the magazine was Seeing and Nothingness. We were on the brink of a remarkable discovery. Following on from the findings with Helen, Weisskranz took a new approach with a human patient, he was called DB, who had undergone surgery to remove a growth affecting the visual cortex on the left-hand side of his brain. The operation had rendered him blind across the right half of his field of vision. DB himself maintained that he had no visual awareness in the affected areas of the field. However, Weisskranz, encouraged by our findings with Helen, decided not to take DB's word for it, and overcoming the patient's protests, he asked him to guess what he would be seeing if he could see. To everyone's surprise, it turned out that he could, in fact, guess both the location and shape of an object to which he believed he was blind. DB himself was the most surprised of all. To him, his success in guessing seemed quite unreasonable. So far as he was concerned, he wasn't the source of his perceptual judgments. His sight had nothing to do with him. Weisskranz named this capacity blind sight. And as most of you will know, blind sight is now a well-established clinical phenomenon. However, when first discovered, it seemed theoretically quite shocking. A patient with blind sight has no visual sensation of the light arriving at his eye, yet he's still able to use the information to perceive the existence of objects out there in the world. No one had ever expected there could be any such dissociation between sensation and perception. However, as I ruminated on the implications for understanding consciousness, I found myself doing a double take. Maybe the real puzzle isn't so much the absence of sensations in blind sight as their presence, the presence of sensations in normal sight. If blind sight is seeing and nothingness, normal sight is seeing and somethingness. And surely it's the nature of this something that we still have to explain. Why do sensations have the mysterious feel they do? Why is there any such thing as phenomenal experience, our subjective, personal experience of interacting with stimuli arriving at our sense organs? Not only in the case of vision, of course, but across all sense modalities. The redness of red, the saltiness of salt, the paininess of pain. What does the extra phenomenal dimension amount to, and what's the use of it? Sensations, let's be clear, have a different remit from perception. Both are forms of mental representation. They're both ideas generated by the brain. But they are about very different kinds of things. Perception is about what's happening out there in the world. The apple is red, the rock is hard, the bird is singing. By contrast, sensation is personal. It's about what's happening to me and how I, as a subject, evaluate it. The pain is in my toe, and it's horrible. The sweet taste is on my tongue, and it's sickly. The red light is before my eyes, and it's stirring me up. It's as if, in having sensations, we're both registering the objective fact of stimulation of our sense organs and expressing our personal bodily opinion about it. And as I'll explain quite shortly, I think that in a way we are doing just that. But why do we do it this way? What makes the subjective present created by sensations seem so rich and deep, as if we're living in what I've called the thick moment? What can the artist Kandinsky mean when he writes, "Color is a power which directly influences the soul"? Color is the keyboard, the eyes are the hammers, the soul is the piano with many strings. Why indeed do we use that strange expression which people have referred to already? It's like something to experience sensations. Is it because sensations are actually like something they can't really be? Now, in asking these questions, we are, of course, up against the hard problem, as it's already been referred to this morning several times, the question of how a physical brain could possibly underwrite the extra-physical properties of phenomenal experience. As Christoph Koch once wrote to me, it's such a mystery, it seems to call for God. Well, for 50 years, I've been searching for an answer that doesn't require God. And in the brief time I have, I want to tell you where I've got to. And conscious of this brief time, it's why I've got a text with me, so I know I might otherwise waste too many words. From the start, I've been suspicious of theories that attempt to identify the neural correlate of consciousness. Many theorists continue to believe that conscious states are identical to brain states. And for them, the obvious and best approach to the problem is to search for brain events that have phenomenal properties built into their physical structure. Now, this is actually quite an old proposal, going back to the 1929 Encyclopedia Britannica, its entry on consciousness, for example, you could have read about the psychonic theory of consciousness. One theory holds that each atom of the physical body possesses an inherent attribute of consciousness. If each atom, or in later forms of this theory, each cell of the body emanates its own consciousness, then the self must actually consist of an amalgam of all these tiny units of awareness. That was 100 years ago. But today, of course, the language has moved on. The psychonic theory doesn't feature among the 18 theories in the consciousness challenge we've been given at this conference. Yet several of the newer theories do sound to me pretty similar. Integrated information theory, which we've already heard about, that, for example, postulates, I'm here quoting Christoph Koch, there is a complete one-to-one mapping between any experience and all of its phenomenal distinctions and relations on the one hand, and the causal structure that is identical to it and that is unfolded from its physical substrate on the other hand. Wow, what a theory that is, which seems to tick all the boxes, or at least you might think so. Yet, as I see it, IIT and all such physical identity theories have actually got off on quite the wrong foot. They were and are attempts to explain how phenomenal properties could be properties of a brain process. And I think this rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is we're trying to explain. Sensations, as I said a moment ago, are not material entities. They are ideas. They are the way your brain represents what's happening at your sense organs and how you feel about it. This means we have to explain their properties, not literally as the properties of brain states, but rather as the properties of mind states dreamed up by the brain. And once we see this to be the task, I think much of the difficulty and mystery falls away. As with any kind of representation, we can assume that representing sensations has to involve a two-stage process. In the case of seeing red, for example, there will be the physical vehicle that carries the information about how the brain evaluates the light arriving at the eyes. And then B, there'll be the cognitive operation that interprets this as the idea of phenomenal redness. By analogy, let's consider a work of literature, say the novel Moby Dick. There will be A, the text that carries the information about the words penned by the author, and then B, there'll be the cognitive operation that interprets these as a story about a white whale. Now, my point is that there's nothing in the physical text of Moby Dick that is white or whale-like. And by the same token, there's going to be nothing in the brain's physical response to red light that is phenomenally red. Here, let me show it first with the book. So we have first the written text, then the reading of the written text, and this as the interpretation of it as the story of a white whale. Now, the brain seeing red. First there'll be the brain presented with a red stimulus, or the eyes. Then there'll be the brain creates this text inside the brain, and then there'll be the interpretation of this as of a phenomenally red sensation. So it's about representation, and I've made it my project down the years to work out just how the brain achieves this feat of representation, particularly in relation to the phenomenal properties of sensations. And the way I've approached it has been by forward engineering. That's to say, I've begun with the end product, sensations as humans experience them today, but rather than treating this, as theorists typically do, as something to deconstruct, I've treated it as something to invent. I've tried to come up with an evolutionary sequence that gets us from nothingness to somethingness, from the blindsight of our remote ancestors to the fully phenomenal sight we humans experience today. The sequence I've arrived at has several twists and turns. I suggested just now that when we have a red sensation, any sensation, it's rather as if we're expressing our personal bodily opinion about the sensory stimulus. And in fact, that's just how I see things having started out. I believe sensations originated in our primitive ancestors as active behavioral responses to stimuli arriving at the body's surface. They were something the subject did about the stimulation long before they evolved to be something the subject felt about it. So let's imagine a primitive amoeba-like animal floating in the ancient seas. Stuff happens to it. Light falls on its body. Pressure waves press against it. Chemicals stick to it. Some of these events are going to be good for the animal, and others are going to be bad. If it's to survive, it must evolve the ability to sort out the good from the bad, to respond differently to the different stimuli, reacting to this one with an ouch, say, or to that one with a whoopee. I call these expressive responses that evaluate the input sentition. To start with, they are entirely local responses. I've called them wriggles of acceptance or rejection. They're organized around the site of stimulation. When, say, red light falls on the animal makes a characteristic wriggle of activity. It wriggles redly. When salt arrives, it makes a different kind of wriggle. It wriggles saltily. Before long, these responses come to be mediated by a central ganglion, or proto-brain. Now, presumably, sentition has been designed by natural selection to be adaptive, with each response taking account of what kind of stimulus is reaching the body's surface and what import it has for the creature's well-being. Thus, even from the earliest stage, we could say that the animal is enacting what the stimulation means to it. Yet to begin with, this enactment, these responses are entirely reflex, and none of the meaning is being held in mind. Let's imagine, however, that as the animal's life becomes more complex, it reaches a stage where it would benefit from retaining some kind of mental record of what's affecting it, a representation of the stimulus that can serve as a basis for planning and decision-making. And it turns out there's a neat way of achieving this. To discover what's happening to me, the animal has only to monitor what I'm doing about it. And it can do this by the simple trick of creating a copy of the command signals for the responses, an efference copy that can be read in reverse to recreate the meaning of the stimulation. In short, the animal can begin to get a feel for the stimulus by accessing the information already implicit in its own response. Now, this, I believe, is the precursor of subjective sensation. But of course, it won't initially have been sensation as we humans know it. It will not have had any special phenomenal quality. Now, the key to acquiring phenomenal properties lies in how sentition goes on evolving. In the early days, it involves bodily behavior out in the open. But there must come a time when such overt behavior is no longer appropriate. The animal no longer wants to recoil reflexly from red light, for example. But it still wants to register that red light is falling on its body and that it feels menacing. So what to do? The solution that natural selection hits on is ingenious. It's for the responses to become internalized or privatized. What occurs is that the command signals, rather than bringing about actual motor behavior, begin to target the internal body map where the sense organs project to the brain. In this way, sentition evolves to be a virtual bodily response, yet still an activity that can be read to provide a mental representation of the stimulation that elicits it. But wait for it. As luck would have it, this privatization has a wonderful result. To illustrate what happens, let me switch to something more like a human brain. Here we have sentition, the evaluative bodily response. Here it's being monitored by a proto-self, the new subject of sensation. And here now, the response is being privatized. And what's the result? It leads to a feedback loop between motor and sensory regions of the brain, a loop with the potential to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. Now, I believe that this development was game-changing. Crucially, it means the activity can be drawn out in time so as to give rise to the thick moment of sensation. But more than this, the activity can be channeled and stabilized so as to create a mathematically complex attractor state, a dynamic pattern of activity that recreates itself. Such an attractor can, in theory, have remarkable hyperdimensional properties, real, unreal, magical. The answer will be in the eye of the beholder. Small adjustments to the circuitry will result in dramatic changes to the attractor's shape, with corresponding changes in the subjective experience. And the upshot, at least in the line that led to humans and other sentient creatures, I'd assume, is the creation of a very special kind of attractor, one the subject reads as having the feel of phenomenal qualia. This attractor is still a type of sentition, which originates as a response to sensory stimulation and still carries information about what's happening to me. But the information now comes in a remarkable new package. It comes, if you like, as part of a riddle written on the brain. So that was brief, but there we are, I'd say, job done. Of course, this story is only a very bare outline, and no doubt it can be only partly right. But with due reservation, I'd say that every step is plausible as an evolutionary development, and it leads to an end state that could, in principle, be responsible for phenomenal consciousness as we humans know it, and as some other non-human animals must surely know it too. But I admit, however, that as an explanation of why sentience evolved, this account is still far from complete. For we've not yet explained what the purpose of it is, what it's all for. What can have been what can have driven these evolutionary developments and those final stages in particular? What can have been the biological advantage of dressing up sensations in this wonderfully exotic way? To quote philosopher Jerry Fodor, the problem is that consciousness seems to be among the chronically unemployed. He's talking about phenomenal consciousness, of course. As far as anybody knows, anything that our conscious minds can do, they could do just as well if they weren't conscious. Why then, he goes on, why then did God bother to make consciousness? What on earth can he have had in mind? Well, I won't presume to answer on behalf of God, but I will try to answer on behalf of natural selection. To explain the use of phenomenal consciousness, I suggest we can and should let our own first-person intuitions be the guide. For who can know better than we do what sentience is for? So ask yourself, what would be missing from your life if you lacked phenomenal consciousness, if you had blind sight, blind touch, blind hearing, blind everything? I think there's an obvious and a true answer, and it's the one I touched on when discussing blind sight. It's that what would be missing would be you. As I remarked earlier, one of the most striking facts about human patients with blind sight is that they don't take ownership of their capacity to see. Lacking visual sensations with phenomenal properties, lacking the somethingness of seeing, they believe that their manifest capacity for visual perception has nothing to do with them. Then imagine what it would be like for you if you were to lack phenomenal experience of any kind at all. If you were to believe that none of your sensory experience was owned by you. Presumably, yourself would disappear. Now, of course, I'm not alone in saying this. The Scottish philosopher David Hume was in no doubt that sensations provide the basis for selfhood. For my own part, he wrote, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular sensation or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. When my sensations are removed for any time as by sound sleep, I may truly be said not to exist. So, remove phenomenal experience and the self ceases to exist. But by the same token, install or reinstall it and the self leaps back into being. Think back then to that point deep in the past when natural selection first breathed life into the loops in your ancestors' brains, and your ancestors woke up to find themselves transformed into sentient, self-conscious beings. In reality, of course, it won't have happened in a flash, but I don't think it need have been a gradual process either. For the fact is that attractors have all or nothing character. So the phenomenalization of sensations could have come about quite rapidly, perhaps within a few hundred generations. Whenever it occurred, I'm sure it will have been a psychological and social watershed. With this marvelous new phenomenon at the center of your being, you'll have begun to matter to yourself in a new and deeper way. You'll have come to believe, as never before, in your own singular significance. And it won't just be you, for you'll soon recognize that other members of your species probably possess conscious selves like yours. So you'll be led to respect their individual worth as well. I feel, therefore I am. You feel, therefore you are too. What's more, you'll soon make a remarkable discovery. It's this, that when you imagine yourself in your fellow creature's place, you can model in yourself what they are feeling. In short, phenomenal consciousness will have become your ticket to having a theory of mind and to living in what I've called the society of selves. Now, where's this leading, and what does it say about the distribution of phenomenal consciousness across the animal kingdom? Among the huge variety of animals alive today, which species other than humans are likely to have crossed this line to sentience? If I'm right, there are two crucial considerations. It's going to depend on the kind of brain the animal has and the kind of life it leads. First, there will have been no physiological means for generating phenomenal experience unless the animal has a brain that can house sensory motor feedback loops capable of creating attractors of the kind I've described. And second, there'll have been no evolutionary incentive for the animal to acquire these attractors unless it has a lifestyle in which possession of a phenomenally enriched sense of self can enhance its personal and social survival. Taking all this into account, I'm led to a surprising and possibly unwelcome conclusion. I believe sentience must be a rather recent evolutionary invention. By far the majority of animals on Earth have neither the brains nor the use for it. And you'll see in this, saying this, I'm going flying flat in the face of what other speakers have tended to say already today. I spell a case out for it in my new book, Sentience, but I'm not going to have time to give the case for who's conscious, who's phenomenally conscious, and who's not right now. It's time to wrap up this talk. So let's return to Helen and frogs. Many years ago, I wrote a paper entitled What the Frog's Eye Tells the Monkey's Brain. I think it's time to consider what a monkey's blindsight tells us about frogs. So, here's Helen reaching peanuts on the left. Here on the right is a bullfrog catching ants. With Helen, I think we can assume that despite her obvious visual competence, there's nothing dislike for her to see. She's not having any visual sensations. It's assuming she really has blindsight. And I conclude that equally, there's nothing it's like for the frog to see. Furthermore, there's probably nothing it's like for the frog to taste, to hear, or to feel pain. I think the same goes for most animals on Earth. However, that's not my last word. I can have another 5 minutes and make a significant concession. I've got 5 minutes. How do I stop that? I'll come to this in a moment. When I argue that animals such as frogs are insentient, don't read this slide quite yet. When I argue that, I don't mean necessarily that they're not conscious at all. Indeed, I've come round to thinking that many insentient animals probably are conscious. Not phenomenally conscious, but conscious in a more robotic, zombie-like way. And I think that's the kind of consciousness that the talks so far in this session have been about. Let me unpack this. As you know, though it's easy to forget it in a conference like this, the term consciousness, as used by cognitive scientists, has a technical meaning that has nothing to do with phenomenal experience or sentience. Rather, it has to do simply with how the brain manages information. Cognitive consciousness, cognizance, according to the best-known theory, involves a central processing unit that has introspective access to a global workspace, where a current set of mental representations are on display. The central processor, with an overview of the workspace, is able to collate and integrate information across different modalities, different domains, so as to allow intelligent judgments and decisions to be made on behalf of the whole system. As such, cognitive consciousness is an effective computational strategy. It streamlines the work of the mind, it resolves potential conflicts, and it gives coherence and direction to thoughts and actions. Now, because this sort of cognitive consciousness is relatively simple to engineer and it gets results, I think we can be sure that some version of it will have been discovered by natural selection and installed in animals' brains long before any of them went on to become sentient. I think predictive processing and all that, for example, occurred long before there was any phenomenal quality associated with it. So long before long ago, sensations with phenomenal properties were brought to the table relatively late. Consciousness preceded phenomenal consciousness, and it's independent of it. So to sum up, I now want to suggest that there are, in fact, three classes of animals along the spectrum of consciousness. So there they are. I think there are unconscious, genuinely unconscious robots among animals, for example, worms and jellyfish. I think there are cognitively conscious animals which are not sentient. That includes all those clever animals like bees and octopuses, maybe even lobsters. And then there are those animals who are cognitively conscious and sentient. Parrots, dogs, and humans, for example. And they're the ones who have crossed that threshold. So where does this leave blindsight? If Helen was not visually sentient, could she have been, or would she have been, cognitively conscious of vision? Even if Helen didn't feel the light at her eyes, did she still have introspective access to her perceptual representations, and did this continue to guide her thought? Now, I have to say, this possibility has only recently occurred to me, 50 years later, I might say. But I've been going back over the films I made of Helen, and I found telltale evidence of signs of her dithering mentally, apparently weighing up what course to follow on the basis of what she's perceiving. This, for example. That's not a sign of cognitive consciousness. I don't know what would be. I've got other examples, but I'm going to skip them because I know I shouldn't go on the other time. So in that case, what about human minds? I suspect that this too isn't necessarily unconscious vision, as it was originally described by mathematicians. And indeed, recent research seems to be confirming this. Jonah McPherson, for example, view of this. There's evidence that in some cases, the patient is actually aware of receiving information from his eyes, even while he still maintains that he has no visible sensations. And perhaps the reason why he himself would describe it as unconscious is because in hard physical vision, in almost all the cases of blindsight, he actually can sense vision in a quite normal way. The fact remains that cognitive consciousness is insufficient insufficient to ground the self, self which we sentient creatures know and value so high. I think, therefore I am no. I can think as much as I like, I still won't be there. I have to be. So,